So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce webinar on ensuring a safe return to the workplace. My name is Ian Ferris, and I'm the Senior Vice President of the Canadian Chamber. And I'm joined today by a stellar cast that will be providing you with their insights and expertise into what is such a critical issue for business, particularly small business, as we return to an in-person workplace. We're going to hear from our experts. Then we'll have an open Q&A session, and I urge you to use the Slido app and submit your questions for our guest contributors' consideration. And there's already a number of questions that have been populated from feedback from the Chamber Network, so we'll look forward to those in our program. So it's now my pleasure to invite Leah Nord, the Canadian Chamber's Senior Director of Workforce Strategies and Inclusive Growth, to introduce our guests and moderate our discussion. So welcome, Leah.
Thanks, Ian, and good afternoon, at least from where I am anyway. I'm in Ottawa today, the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And there are timely webinars, and then there are timely webinars. So this is really, really appreciated today. I'm going to introduce our two guest panelists. They'll each make a presentation, and as Ian said, then we'll turn it over to Q&A. For the time we have remaining, I've already populated it with questions. Would encourage others to do so as well. And with that said, I'm going to introduce, first of all, Gordon Frost. He is the partner and member of the Canadian leadership team at Mercer Canada. He's Canada's Ottawa officer leader. And as such, he leads a team of professionals who strive to understand organizations' needs and help them build healthier and more sustainable futures for their employees. He also leads Mercer's public sector industry team, which specializes in addressing the unique challenges of governments, crown corporations, universities, municipalities, and other public sector organizations. He first joined Mercer in 2000, and prior to taking on his current responsibilities, he successfully led the career business sector portion for 8 years, enabling clients to develop, reward, and communicate with their workforces of the future. Prior to that, he spent 3 years in Mercer's New York office and over 2 years as Vice President of Global Compensation for a Canadian multinational organization. Gordon is on the board of directors of Project Terra Firma Canada, which employs a private equity approach to investing its business and resources to assist sustainable economic development, social growth, and well-being of peoples in developing communities. He holds an MBA from the University of Western Ontario and a bachelor's degree in commerce with great distinction from McGill University. Thanks, Gordon. And our other speaker today here is Trevor Lawson, and he is a partner at the Labor and Employment Group in Toronto at McCarthy Tétrault. His broad practice encompasses all aspects of labor and employment-related litigation, labor relations, corporate transactions, executive compensation, and privacy. He has represented employers in proceedings before the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, Court of Appeals of Ontario, Ontario Labour Relations Board, Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, Boards of Arbitration, Coroner's Inquests, and other administrative tribunals. His clients carry on business in a wide range of sectors, including hospitality, retail, consumer goods, gaming, manufacturing, property management, banking, and finance. Trevor is the hospitality sector lead as part of the firm's National Retail and Consumer Markets Group. Trevor regularly makes presentations to employers on a wide range of employment-related subjects and is regularly interviewed and quoted as a labor and employment law expert for radio, television, newspapers, and magazines. Trevor received his BA honors in political science from McMaster University in 1995, his LLB from Dalhousie in 98. He's a member of the Canadian Bar Association, American Bar Association, and the Canadian Association of Counsel to Employers. So thank you both for being here, both interesting perspectives. And with that said, Trevor, I'm going to hand it over to you first. You can share your screen and start your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leah, and thank you to everybody who's joined. I can't see you, but hopefully we'll be able to answer some of your questions in the brief time we have together today. I also should say that Leah's introduction of me was somewhat inaccurate, and that I used to have a broad labor and employment practice, but for the last 18 months, all I've been working on is COVID-related matters, and most recently, vaccination policies. Let me share my screen, and hopefully everyone can see the slide deck that I now have up on the screen. And I can move through that. Here we go. So my aspect of the presentation is back to the workplace with a big maybe in brackets, because while many of you who responded to the pre-presentation survey indicated that you had put in place your return to work plans, almost as many of you said you had not. As you're all aware, by the way things have moved over the last 18 months, there is no plan that is final until it actually happens. And if employers haven't learned anything over the last 18 months of the pandemic, they have to remain nimble and be able to adjust. So the three things that I want to cover today in the brief time I have is around the issue of return to office, putting your plans in place, first and foremost. Secondly, remote work arrangements and issues that you need to consider in implementing those on a more permanent basis. And lastly, the topic that's been on everyone's minds, particularly over the last couple of weeks, mandatory vaccination policies. So I'm going to jump right in. As I mentioned, it's been an extremely difficult 18 months as employers have struggled to manage the pandemic. Many employers at the outset of the pandemic put in place committees representing all aspects of the organization, from human resources to operations, in order to manage the business and, most importantly, from my perspective, to manage the workforce, and to determine how, as an organization, you would continue doing the work that you do and providing the goods and services you provide to your customers and clients, and still maintain the health and safety of your employees. For many workplaces that were deemed non-essential, which includes many office environments, what that meant was that everybody goes home and everybody works from home, and would continue to do so until such time as it was safe to return to the workplace. It seems that we are nearing that time, that as we reach a point where the majority of those who are eligible to be vaccinated are vaccinated, as governments are easing restrictions on our mobility, that many employers are considering a return to the physical workplace, and considering a return of their employees to that workplace, to the physical workplace. And, you know, it's giving rise to a number of issues. Many of you identified issues around employee anxiety and concerns about managing hesitation of your employees to come back to the physical workplace. So there's a number of things that we recommend you consider as you, for those of you who have not finalized your return to workplace, and even for those of you who have, but may still have an opportunity to tweak the plan that you've put in place. If you have in place a committee that's been managing these issues, we would, of course, recommend that that committee continue to be responsible for managing the return to office protocols that you put in place. The real threshold question is who needs to be here back in the physical workplace, and why, and when. So while there is this general sense that employers really want everybody to be back in the physical workplace, it still is a matter of, given the ongoing risk of COVID, a question of, why do we need to have employees back in the workplace? It's certainly a question your employees are going to ask of you. What is the benefit to be gained by all of us returning to the physical workplace? And I think you need to turn your mind to that question and be ready to answer it when your employees ask. The second threshold question is who? There are certain roles that are exclusively and only suited to be performed in the physical workplace. And those individuals likely have been attending at the workplace throughout the pandemic. There's an intermediate category of employees where it's perhaps preferable but not necessary that they perform their duties in the physical workplace. And then there is likely a third category of employees for whom they can just as easily work from home as they can in the work in the physical workplace. So the question will need to be asked, and will certainly be asked by your employees, as to why they need to return in their specific role. The last question that you'll need to turn your mind to is the when. Many employers, as vaccines started to become more widely available, as numbers of cases on a daily basis continued to drop, targeted after Labor Day as being their reopening date, and in some cases a full return to work, in some cases a gradual return to work after Labor Day. We've seen now that many employers are backing those dates up to October or November, so that they can put in place, in some cases, mandatory vaccination policies that we'll talk about in a moment, or testing arrangements or other arrangements before they have everybody return to the office. So the question of timing is one that has changed a lot for employers as the pandemic has progressed. And it's a question that, if you haven't already turned your mind to it, you should, of course, do so and ensure that the date that you choose is one that will permit employees to return to work in a way that's safe. Health and safety is another key consideration. In fact, it's the one that's first and foremost amongst most of our clients when they're considering the return to work plans. Of course, every employer in whatever jurisdiction has an obligation to take all steps reasonable in the circumstances to protect the health and safety of their employees. And as part of your return to work plan, you'll have to consider how you deal with ongoing issues around screening, testing, masking, PPE, physical distancing, workplace reconfiguration, sanitization, ventilation, and vaccination, which, as I mentioned, I'll speak to in more detail in a moment. The key here is that there are different requirements from province to province around these issues. There's different requirements among certain municipalities and cities within provinces. And your committee or the individual who's responsible for managing your plan around return to office needs to be cognizant of all of the different standards that you may be subject to in different jurisdictions. And that's to the point of legal compliance. Somebody needs to be made the point person or point people for ensuring that, as regulatory and public health requirements continue to evolve and change, in some case advance and then move in a different direction, that someone needs to be mindful of that and ensure that your plan is nimble enough to adjust to it. In terms of the return to work policy, there are different other policies that may be impacted by your return to work policy, may require you to either implement a new policy or adjust your current policy. So I suspect that most of you will have a privacy policy in place. You'll have to consider if you are collecting data from your employees about, vaccination status, around exemptions to a vaccination requirement, or the results of rapid antigen testing, that you're collecting that information in a way that's consistent with your privacy policy. As I mentioned, I'll discuss vaccination policies in a moment. I suspect you probably don't have an existing vaccination policy, and if you are implementing one, it'll be brand new. And similarly with hybrid and remote work policies, in the next slide, I'll discuss those in some greater detail. The last aspect of returning to work is communications. As many of you have correctly identified in your responses to the pre-presentation surveys, many of your employees are extremely anxious about this. This is a sea change in many cases from the work environment they've enjoyed over the last 18 months, or at least worked in over the last 18 months. They will be, in some cases, having to take public transit, get on elevators, and do other things that may cause them some concern. So it'd be very important, if you haven't already done so, to ensure that you are communicating and fully transparent around your return to work plans, all the measures that you're taking to ensure their health and safety. And also to ensure that you have supports in place through your EAP or other third-party providers to assist those employees who are experiencing anxiety about returning to the physical workplace, but who may not have a valid medical exemption or other exemption that would require you to accommodate them still working from home. The next issue that I want to discuss is the remote work policy. So the COVID-19 has caused many employers to rethink the traditional in-office everyday work arrangements and discover that certain roles don't require employees to be in the office each day, or in some cases any days, and that there are some mutual advantages to work from home arrangements for both employers and employees. And it's also caused employers, as we turn our minds to return to work, to consider whether some of the work at home arrangements that were put in place on a temporary basis during the pandemic should become permanent work from home arrangements, or some hybrid combination of work in office and work from home. That discussion, that thinking raises several issues that would need to be clearly addressed at the outset in a remote work policy, if you don't already have one in place. And the issues that have come up most frequently in the discussions we've been having with clients are around clarifying for any particular employee how frequently they will be required to attend at the workplace, and whether the employee will get to choose the days on which they attend at the office, or whether that will be something that is determined by management, either on a permanent basis or on something that may change on a week by week, month by month basis. How much notice, if any, the employer is required to give the employee if they are going to be required to attend at the office outside the set schedule agreed upon. The question of whether the work arrangement is going to be temporary or permanent is one that ought to be considered. We would recommend that each employee who is being provided with either permanent or either a full-time or hybrid work from home arrangement enter into an individual agreement to that effect that would allow the employer to terminate that arrangement on some number of weeks' notice to the employee. Question of whether the employee will be permitted to work anywhere in the world, in other jurisdictions in Canada, outside of Canada, etc., is one that should be addressed at the outset also. I am not a tax or a corporate lawyer, but I am aware that where employees, certain kinds of employees at least, are working in jurisdictions outside the location where the business is carrying on business, it could give rise to immigration requirements. It could give rise to certain corporate and tax implications around whether the business is now carrying on business in that other jurisdiction or has a permanent establishment, and other employment-related considerations that will need to be discussed before the employee is permitted to relocate wherever they wish to relocate in order to perform the work. There may also be issues around how hours of work will be managed or monitored. Will they be required to log in at a certain time and log out at a certain time in order to ensure that the employee is on site, virtually on site, and performing the duties that are required of them? A significant issue also of how data will be managed in an office environment. It is relatively simple to manage confidentiality of physical files and of electronic files when an employee is working in a home office where others could have access to the office itself, where the same security measures may not be in place as they would be in a physical workplace. the employee will need to be advised of whatever security protocols they will be required to observe in order to maintain confidentiality around the matters that they're working on. There may also be a question of expenses associated with the home office. If it's a voluntary situation and the employee is requesting it and the request has been granted, then the employee would likely be responsible for their own office equipment. If it's a matter of the employer wishing to incentivize the employee to work from home, or even further requiring the employee to work from home, it will likely be the case that the employer will be required to bear the cost of whatever equipment the employee needs in order to operate their home office. And lastly, there's an issue of health and safety, how that will be managed in a remote work environment. The employee working in a home office, it could still be injured while doing so, and that injury could be considered to arise out of in the course of employment and give rise to a workers' compensation claim. So in order to ensure that the employee's home office operates in a manner that is similar in terms of safety to the office in which they would work if they were in the physical workplace, an employer can impose certain safety standards for the employee's home office, which the employee would be required to agree to as a condition of their work from home arrangement. The last topic, and again, this is the one that that most employers and many of you in your response to the survey questions have been most interested in, and it's certainly one that has been most prominent in the media in the last couple of weeks, is the issue of a mandatory vaccination policy. And I can say without hesitation that the tide on this issue has shifted dramatically in the past couple of weeks. We were having this webinar a month ago. I would have likely been telling you that the vast majority of employers are not implementing mandatory vaccination policies, and that there is substantial legal risk with doing so. That has changed dramatically. And the real driver for the change, in my view, can be traced back to August 13, when the federal government announced that it would be implementing a mandatory vaccination policy for federal public service employees, and would be mandating that similar policies be implemented for Crown corporations and federally regulated private sector employers. Since that time, we've seen a flood of announcements from the private sector announcing mandatory vaccination policies for their employees. And we've seen that among banks, insurance companies, telecom companies, airlines, railways, and among other provincially regulated private sector employers. In the survey, the majority of you said that you wouldn't be requiring employees to be vaccinated or provide proof of vaccination, and you would permit unvaccinated employees to attend at your offices. It was very close as between the yeses and the nos on the answer to that question. In a recent survey conducted by KPMG that was released on August 19th, 62% of employers in Canada said they intend to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy. Now, from a legal perspective, mandatory vaccination policies are not unlawful per se. They give rise to certain risks, primarily around privacy, human rights, and accommodation, and potentially constructive dismissal risk for non-union employees, and the risk of a grievance in relation to unionized employees. But those risks can be managed and mitigated. If you do decide as an organization that a mandatory vaccination policy is appropriate for your workplace, there are certain key elements that need to be addressed in the policy. First and foremost, there should be a purpose statement. And the purpose broadly for all of the mandatory vaccination policies that we've assisted with or seen is to protect the health and safety of workers, of their families, of the communities in which everybody lives and works. There are also recommendations that have been advanced by certain public health authorities regarding vaccination policy, such as Toronto Public Health and Peel Public Health and others in different provinces, which do recommend that employers implement a form of a vaccination policy. You have to consider also the scope of the policy. If you have a certain group of employees who will never attend an office or another facility, then it's likely unnecessary for you to require those employees to provide proof of vaccination. If employees are attending in-person events outside of the office, it may make sense for those employees to provide proof of vaccination as a condition of attending that event, or if employees are engaged in a business-related travel. You'll also need to clearly stipulate what the rules are. And what we've seen in the basic mandatory vaccination policy to date is that that employees are required to provide proof of vaccination by a specific date. Under the federal announcement, employees were given until September 30th in order to provide that, which was from the date of the announcement, roughly 6 weeks. That would provide employees who have not yet become vaccinated with a opportunity to do so before they're required to return to the office or the physical workplace. Generally speaking, full vaccination means that someone has received the completed series of doses of a vaccine that's been approved by Health Canada, and that 14 days has passed since they've completed that series. The proof of vaccination generally required under these policies is the government-issued vaccine dose receipt. And in order to mitigate the human rights risks associated with such a policy, the policy will have to provide exemptions for those employees who cannot be vaccinated due to a reason protected under human rights legislation. And the most common reasons that have arisen have been a medical related reason as to why someone cannot be vaccinated, or a creed or religious based reason as to why someone cannot be vaccinated. Just like any other form of accommodation, you are entitled to receive documentation from the employee which confirms that they cannot be vaccinated. So for a medical reason, it will most commonly be a note from the medical professional stipulating why the employee cannot be vaccinated due to a medical condition. And for a religious or creed exemption, it would most commonly take the form of a letter from a faith leader that indicates that the employee cannot be vaccinated due to the religion to which they're an adherent. Excuse me. That information, in order to mitigate the privacy risks associated with its collection, should only be retained for as long as is necessary to fulfill the purposes for which you've collected it. So we've seen many policies where once the employee provides proof of vaccination, the employer will note that the employee is confirmed that they are fully vaccinated, and then will delete that government issued proof of vaccination because it's no longer required. If you're collecting information regarding an employee's exemption request, that information should be held in confidence like you would any other personal information collected from your employees. The question also arises is how you accommodate those who cannot be vaccinated due to a legitimate exemption. The two most common forms of accommodation thus far are if the employee is still required to attend at the office, that they undergo regular rapid antigen testing, and the employer would generally be required to bear the cost of that testing, or that the employee continue to work from home. And it will be a business decision as to whether it works for the employer to have that employee continue to work from home, or whether if the employer prefers or wishes to have the employee return to office, the employer could do so, and the employee can be subjected to the regular rapid antigen screening. Policy will also need to address the consequences of non-compliance. The range of consequences can include termination without cause, if we're talking about non-union employees, can include termination for cause for both union and non-union employees, and unpaid leaves of absence for employees who do not wish to adhere to the policy. It could also include potentially benefits changes for those employees who refuse without a valid protected reason to become vaccinated, if there is an increased cost associated with insuring those employees. The last thing the policy should do is anticipate change. It may be that excuse me, it may be that public health circumstances change, and public health or government actually imposes a more mandatory vaccination policy, or implements recommendations around what an employer-related vaccination policy should look like if an employer is going to implement one, such as Toronto Public Health has done here in Ontario, and Peel Public Health has done as well. If there are recommendations that come out, or if there are requirements that are issued by government or public health, the policy should, of course, adhere to those requirements, just as all your other health and safety measures are required to adhere to government and public health requirements. So those are the basic tenets of a vaccination policy. I think I've used my time, so I can deal with any additional questions that arise around vaccination policy once we get to the Q&A portion. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I can turn it over. There we go.
Great. And thank you, Trevor, so much. That was incredibly insightful. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Gordon. I'm monitoring the questions, and we'll take it those questions from there. So Gordon, over to you if you'd like to share your screen, please.
All right, Leah. Hey, thanks very much. And that was very, very interesting. So I was riveted by Trevor's part, but excited to talk to you a little bit more about Mercer's view of flexible work more broadly. And so from the perspective of flexible working, and maybe you can can you see the screen all right and everything looks good? What? I always like to check. But look, so we're calling this the grand reopening. And even though there will be agility and there is question around the timing of when we will be back in the office, I can tell you that when we do surveys and studies, and a lot of the data we'll present to you is based on recent client surveys that we've done, people are excited to get back into the office. They do want the interpersonal connection. They're excited about the future of work, but there's no question that it will look different. And so it's hard to believe that it's been almost 2 years, since we started this whole flexible working experiment, if you want to call it that. And truthfully, a lot has changed, right? So the entire world has changed. In 2020, as you all know, an emergency pandemic sent workers home. But what's interesting is a lot of employers have decided they actually quite like it. And so it's driving changes in employee preferences. And people are hesitant to get back into the workplace, even though they're excited to do so. So we've seen employee preference as a key driver. They enjoy working from home. They like the flexibility. They want to have more flexibility in the workplace is another thing that they're telling us. And there's continued concerns about health and well-being. So even though people like the connection, they miss the social aspects of work, they miss the cultural aspects of work at times, they are concerned about coming into the workplace, and there are hesitations around that. Trevor touched on a number of them. Vaccination obviously is a key one, but there's broader issues than that, and people are hesitant. So that's what's driving a lot of organizations to consider policies around flexibility, and much greater policies around flexibility than we saw in the past. We see that it drives better engagement from people. We've seen that people are actually performing better when they have flexibility. They're surprised at how well they can perform working remotely or working from home. It enhances their employee value proposition. So, we'll talk about this more in a few minutes, but employees are saying they would prefer to work for an employer that provides more flexibility. They don't want to be in the office 5 days a week. So that's a key driver of why organizations are looking into this. It expands your talent pool. So there's many stories now about with remote working, your employee pool is no longer just your physical, region that you're in. You can be hiring employees from anywhere. And Trevor talked about some of the risks of that. And does that lead to permanent establishment in certain jurisdictions? Does that have employment law concerns? Certainly all of those things need to be considered, but definitely it allows you to recruit from a wider pool of people than you did previously. And it gives your employees opportunities to to apply for positions in areas that they would have never been eligible before. So it has clearly changed the nature of the talent pool, we think, in a fundamental way. It changes your real estate costs potentially. So while organizations, we'll see this in a minute, they're not giving up their physical real estate yet, they are rethinking how much space do they need and what does that space need to look like. And then often, as I'm sure many of you would know as small business and medium-sized business owners, that's a significant cost. And there's a sustainability aspect, right? And I thought a lot of people are still concerned about climate change and thinking about if I have to commute less, if I can work virtually, if I need less physical workspace, there's all kinds of positive implications as a result of that. So those are the reasons people are telling us that flexibility is top of mind for them. But what we found in our study is that, first of all, flexibility can come in many forms. So we spend a lot of time talking about where work gets done. But as you'll see in a few minutes, there's other aspects that leading employers are also thinking about. And we'll talk about those more in a few minutes. As I said a minute ago, companies are not willing to cancel their leases just yet. So that was a key finding, is they're not looking to go completely remote. And that the nature of work prohibits flexibility for some types of jobs. And so again, we'll talk about this in a few minutes, the aspect that it may not be a one-size-fits-all policy for all of your employees, because the key driver in our view is the nature of work and the nature of work tied to specific jobs. So you may have some categories of jobs in your organization for which flexibility is much more possible. And then you may have other categories of jobs where it's more limited. And we encourage people to think about that. Companies are telling us that fundamentally, though, they are planning to support flexibility, at least in a basic way. And they're thinking about, as Trevor said earlier, the geographic implications of that. So they're thinking, does flexibility mean you can work from home, but you still need to live in the same city? Does it mean you can stay in the same province? Does it mean you could move across Canada and still have your job? Or could you genuinely work from anywhere? And different organizations are developing different policies around that, clearly. Ultimately, though, the studies that we've seen, if you look at the left-hand side of the page, the vast majority, more than 2/3, have told us that they're considering some kind of a flexible hybrid model, right? So they're not looking for full flexibility or full remoteness. As you see on the right side, we had actually 0% of our survey respondents said they're looking to go fully remote. We see a variety of different models at play, but clearly the vast majority have told us that they'll do some kind of a hybrid model. And then when we dove a little bit deeper to say, what do we think that will look like? Really, it's the middle of this page is what we thought was most interesting. More than half said that they'll have some sort of a hybrid model where people are either in the office maybe 1 or 2 days a week, or 3 or 4 days a week. So that's what they're kind of considering. Very few are saying fully remote. Very few are saying full-time in the office, interestingly. Or not very few, about 1/3, but the vast majority are in the middle two groups, which I found very interesting as well. And they're continuing to work on what that might look like. And so to diverge for just a minute, one of the things that we're also finding is that the war for talent has been re-engaged, right? So lots of organizations are telling us they're having trouble finding the employees that they need. They're having trouble retaining their best employees. People are moving for different jobs that could be anywhere. So if you're experiencing this, you're definitely not alone, right? The top 3 things that we're hearing as far as the difficulty in recruiting is finding the right skills. So skills shortages were an issue before the pandemic, and they've come roaring back again. Not enough qualified employees to hire, right? So the skills are out there, but they're in very, very short supply. And as we said a minute ago, there's new competitors, right? So you're not just competing with the people in your local market. You could potentially be competing with, competitors located anywhere in the world. So these are what we're seeing as the drivers of the difficulty in recruiting. But then when we asked employers, what are you doing strategically to try and attract and retain the employees that you need? Flexibility came up to the top of it again. So it used to be that the things you're seeing lower down on this page, offering more competitive compensation, better benefits offerings, that's still coming out here. And 50% of employers are telling us that's still a priority for them. But coming out ahead of that is flexibility, right? Remote work, flexible schedules, flexible location, providing more well-being and mental health support. So again, in other webinars I'm sure you've joined, and Trevor touched on this a few minutes ago, there's much more anxiety that we've seen through the pandemic. There's more issues around mental well-being. It really has come to the forefront. And so organizations clearly are focusing more resources on that. And then the third one, which I love to see, is continuing to progress DE&I initiatives. And I saw some of the questions that people have already submitted. How do you ensure that if you're putting in place a flexible policy, that doesn't, inadvertently negatively impact certain parts of your population, be that women, be that visible minorities, be that new Canadians? There's definitely concerns around that, but we're seeing organizations are continuing to focus on that, and I think that's very positive. And it's important because when we ask employees again, is this important to you? They're resoundingly saying yes. So 56% of employees that we surveyed said, I would consider switching jobs if it was not an option for me, if flexibility was not an option with my current employer. Another 38% said, it's somewhat important, it would impact my job satisfaction. I might not seek a different employer, but I would be less satisfied. Only 6% said it wasn't important to them. And this importance ranked even higher for millennials and the next generation of workers, right? It was identified as the most important employer-provided benefit for working parents, right? So it's part of the employee value proposition, and employers that are able to offer a more flexible work environment or meet their employees' needs for flexibility are more likely to attract and retain the best people. So that's the driver beyond pandemic, I think, is that it really becomes part of the value proposition and a key tool in your arsenal in the war for talent. But I think one of the key questions, and this came up in some of the questions that were submitted as well, is, what if the employer or management has one perspective, but employees are thinking something else? How do you find the right balance? And we feel it really is a balancing act. It can't just be the employer's perspective that dominates, and it can't just be, we'll do whatever employees want, right? There has to be some kind of a flexibility strategy that balances the employee experience with what's needed for the organization to sustain your profitable growth, right? So you need to create an environment that somehow balances both of those things, and that will be different from an organization to the next. So we're seeing that organizations really are focusing on this. Nearly 90% of organizations told us that they're developing flexible working strategies now. And again, as Trevor said earlier, they're agile. So we thought it would be back into the workplace starting after Labor Day. Now it's being pushed off. So it's not just about timing, but they're also thinking about, how often should we be in the workplace? What times of day are we working? There's a variety of different levers that you can pull when you're thinking through an overall flexible working strategy. So as we think about those in more detail, it's not just the where work gets done, which is what we spend a lot of time talking about and is discussed on the left-hand side of this schematic, but it also can be, can you schedule work differently? Can people work outside of normal business hours, right? At the time that works best for them. If they have, responsibilities around the home and they want to work in the evening and do childcare during the day or trade off childcare with their partner, are those things that you could consider? And in some cases it is. How the work gets done can also be flexed, really. So maybe you work more at some periods of the year and less during other periods. Or do you share jobs with a colleague, right? Especially if you're virtual, maybe you don't both need to physically be there, or you could share the times that you're on site and the times that you're flexible. And then who is even a question that people are asking as well. And by who, we mean that, some of the work could be done by employees, Some of the work could be done by contractors potentially. That could be outsourced or offshored. Some of the work could be automated even. And so organizations really are starting to think very broadly about flexible working, even though the focus more recently has been on the question of where. And as I said at the very beginning of my discussion, it will change by job or by clusters of job or categories of job. So one of the things that we suggest that organizations should do is really assess the capacity to flex on a job by job basis, or maybe a department by department basis, or job family by job family basis. And so these give you a couple of examples where we looked at engineering professionals versus customer support, right? And they have different flexibility potential on the different elements of flexibility. So this obviously is an organization that's gone further around thinking, more strategically about the different elements and how their different types of jobs can fit within these flexibility quotients, if you want to call them that. But this idea of segmenting your employee population is gaining a lot of traction. So many of you might have thought about, employee segmentation from an employee value proposition perspective, right? Different segments of your population might value benefits more than retirement, more than pay, more than career opportunity. So we've talked about that, and there's literature about that. But this idea of segmentation is also something that I think you can think about from a flexibility perspective as well, and thinking about both what the needs of the employees are and what the demands of the job are from the perspective of flexibility. The last thing I would say when you're thinking about flexibility or flexible work policies within your organization is it should not just be an HR decision, right? These are decisions that organizations need to make holistically, taking into perspective, different points of view. So HR can drive the process or lead the process, but there's also, Trevor talked on IT, concerns or IT security concerns or IT functionality concerns. So that clearly needs to have a seat at the table. There's a facilities perspective that we talked about a little while ago. There's a finance perspective as far as, does the employer have a responsibility to fund part of this? Do they not? If there's savings that you're going to generate from flexibility, do you want to reinvest some of those? That'll be different organization by organization. And then obviously the legal components, which Trevor did a great job on, but within your organization could be different from what we talked about a few minutes ago. The last thing that I'll say around flexibility, and we did touch on this for just a minute, is that with the return to workplace, there are clearly issues around mental health and well-being, anxiety, different concerns. This is where we really suggest listening to your employees, right? Considering their input, understanding what's working for them and what's not. And again, it could be different by individual or by employee segment or employee population. So some of the suggestions that I'll leave you with on this topic, and look, we could have another whole webinar on this, but validate their range of emotions, recognizing that different people will be coming at this from different perspectives that could be very personal. And all of those points of view are very valid. Acknowledging that it may be stressful, that different people might be stressed about taking public transit or being in an elevator or having to be in the workplace with people who may or may not be vaccinated and they may not know, right? So that is stressful for organizations, and you might develop a different policy about how you deal with it, but at least acknowledging the stress, I think, is important. Being specific about what your plans are and transparent about what you may or may not be willing to talk about right now. So even at Mercer, we've been very transparent about the fact that we're going to do everything that we can do under the law from a vaccination perspective, but recognizing that our advice around what is legally possible is evolving. So we've been very clear in saying that we do want to follow the law, but we also do want to advocate for vaccines within our workplace. But as that changes, we'll continue to update our policies. You can ask employees what's most important to them. So there's lots of employee listening tools that exist, or employee survey tools. We are suggesting that people take it slow. So this idea of having a hybrid workplace and a gradual return to the workplace, we've seen be successful with a number of organizations. And recognizing that just like it was at the start of the pandemic, back at the beginning of 2020, there will be a period of adjustment as people come back into the workplace and as people adjust to the new normal. So understanding that that may impact productivity in the interim, that may impact employee morale or employee engagement, giving people the time to adjust and planning for that is the last thing that we would suggest from a mental well-being perspective. So I know I went through a lot of material. I had many more slides that were a lot more, content rich. But Leah, happy to turn it back and see what kind of questions there are and where you'd like to go from here.
Yes, Gordon, listen, thank you so much, and a ton of food for thought. I am actually jumping right into questions here because there are a couple of key ones. Gordon, I'm going to let you catch your breath. Trevor, there's a couple of legal ones here. I'm paraphrasing, so whoever's watching Slido, I'm going to drive them crazy. But Trevor, around the privacy piece, there's two questions maybe to answer here. First is I'm getting questions about, can you ask at an interview whether the candidate is vaccinated or not? And secondly, in the privacy space, you've talked about why people cannot get vaccinated, why they might not be vaccinated, but how does this push on a privacy or even like in a larger workforce for those, I'm getting the question here, who are, there are those who are vaccinated. Can they know who's not vaccinated? How can you ensure safety in such an environment? Thanks.
Yeah, so let me start with the first one about asking a candidate for employment about their vaccination status. The short answer is no, you should not ask a candidate in interview whether or not they are fully vaccinated. But you can include in a job posting a statement which says that that as a condition of employment, candidates who are provided with a conditional offer of employment will be required to provide proof that they are fully vaccinated, and subject to any accommodations that may be required for those who cannot be fully vaccinated. So impose a similar standard to the one that you would impose on employees. Now, we wouldn't recommend asking for that proof of vaccination until you extend a conditional offer of employment to a candidate. So in other words, you're not gathering that information from everybody who applies for a job. You're only gathering it from those individuals to whom you actually extend a conditional offer of employment. And you will accommodate those candidates who cannot be vaccinated due to a legitimate protected ground in the same way as you would accommodate an incumbent employee who can't be vaccinated due to a protected ground. To the second question of asking or advising employees if their coworkers are fully vaccinated or of their vaccination status, the answer to that is no, unless the employee consents to that information being shared with their coworkers, and I suspect they would not. That is information that if you receive it from an employee needs to be held in confidence in the same way you would hold in confidence any other medical related personal information collected from an employee. And then I think the latter part of that question had to do with alleviating fears from those employees who are vaccinated about the risks of coming to work with unvaccinated colleagues. I mean, and that's the key driver behind the recently announced mandatory vaccination policies. Is that we commonly have been thinking about this issue from the perspective of those who don't want to be vaccinated having to provide, to get vaccinated or provide proof as to why they can't. But in most workplaces, you're going to have 80% of the workforce, if they're a mirror of the adult population at large, who have become fully vaccinated and who want to come to work in an environment where their safety is assured, and who do not want to work alongside unvaccinated colleagues because they may have children at home who aren't yet 12 years old, who can't be vaccinated. They may have immunocompromised relatives, parents, etc., with whom they live with or interact, who can't who are susceptible to more severe outcomes from COVID-19. And that the employers want to be able to say to their fully vaccinated employees, you will not be working alongside those who aren't fully vaccinated. Or if you are, they're few and far between, because we're only allowing accommodations for those who can't be vaccinated, and they're required to undergo rapid antigen tests.
Okay. Okay. And I do have a question for Gordon. I'm going to sneak another one in here though for you, Trevor, and it's around, can you delineate between, like, can you treat a volunteer like an employee, or is there a difference there? We're getting questions around volunteers in general, volunteer board members, inviting to events, so on and so forth. Can you just really quickly try and address that?
Very quickly, you should treat others who come into the workplace in the same way as you treat employees.
Okay.
If you're requiring it of your employees, you should be requiring it of everybody else. Great,
thank you, very much appreciated. And Gordon, I'm gonna, as you say, we could have a webinar on any number of these, but a theme I'm picking up from some of the questions. There is that equity piece. There was the article published yesterday, but it's not only women, right? How this might not affect, but I was interested in your balancing act and that piece that crosses over in the middle. Lots of good advice around transparency, segmentation, specificity, validation. But Gordon, just, you're not going to make everybody, that piece in the middle, that's not everybody there in the middle. Like as employers, we have to make decisions and have to have workforce. How do you is there any advice on how to manage that in gen, you've got to come to one, but you almost kind of have to own it. If you could give us some thoughts on that.
I completely agree with you. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, which really is about owning it and recognizing that there's compromises that the employer is trying to make, right? And you're trying to balance the needs of your organization, the needs of your clients, if you have clients that you work with, right? The needs of all of your employees, right? Understanding that they will differ from one person to the next. And so trying to make the best fit inherently means that some people will get a better fit than others, but that you're trying to do your best, right? And so I'm working with one organization where they did do employee surveys to understand the employees' desire for flexibility. And they got one group of employees, all from one department, that really thought that they could work entirely from home and preferred working entirely from home. They made the decision as an employer that they felt that it was important that employees be on site at least some of the time, from a developmental perspective, from a cultural perspective, from a helping to engage new employees perspective. They came to that decision from an organizational point of view. And they were really worried because they said, this group of employees is going to be upset that we didn't listen to them, even though they're going to a policy where they're only asking people to come in 2 days a week, right? So my advice to them was, I said, look, yes, this group of people said we'd like to be entirely working from home, but you can come back to them and say, we listened to you, we listened to everybody else. These are the reasons why we've decided not to go 100% remote, but you're still getting the flexibility to work from wherever you'd like 60% of the time. So it's not binary that we didn't listen to you or we didn't give you what you wanted. We did listen to you, we listened to everybody else, and we've tried to come to a compromise where everybody's getting some of what was important to them.
Thanks, because that's going to be, but the tough piece for sure. And again, I'm going to hand it back to you with a big thank you, and hopefully maybe in a couple of months, everybody a part 2 to this. So Ian, over to you.
Great, thanks, Leah, and a big thank you to Gordon and Trevor. What a great set of insights. These are very complex issues, as we know, and businesses are facing them on the ground. So, thank you for your work today and your contributions. In addition, I'd also like to express our thanks to your colleagues, Julie Potvin from Mercer here in Ottawa, and Carl Tabak from McCarthy's in Montreal, for helping to recruit such great talent for this program. And has been mentioned in the chat function with a number of people. We'll be sharing a recorded copy of this program with participants, and you can look forward to receiving that by email in the next few days. We're not back into the workplace yet, so mail won't work. On behalf of our participants and the Canadian Chamber staff, thank you for attending this webinar, and we wish you a great rest of the day and week. as we head into a long weekend. So thank you very much.